After finding fingerprint-shaped bruises on my elderly dad, I faked a stroke and got admitted to his nursing home, caught the nurses sedating him illegally, and put them all on trial. I was 45 when my dad called me by the wrong name. I was devastated and remember feeling like the world was crumbling around me. In the years leading up to this moment, he had already started losing his sanity. And when I realized just how crazy his antics were getting, I started taking more time off work to care for him. But still, he showed no signs of improvement. And it was just when we finally started making progress with his Alzheimer's, he called me by his brother's name instead of my own. And then he tried to get me to put him on the phone with his dead wife. He cried when I reminded him of her passing, then asked to talk to her again a few hours later. Soon after that came the moment every son dreads. I had to admit him to a nursing home. I was lucky enough to be able to afford a nice one, but it still hurt, a lot. By this point, he was in a wheelchair, and as I brought him up to his room with the nurse, I felt like I was the Athenian court, pushing Socrates towards the cup of poison that led to his death. When we got to his bed, I set everything up in the way he liked. "I don't blame you, son. I can barely put up with myself. I don't even know how you did for so long," he said with a forced laugh, his voice so hoarse it sounded like a dry whisper. Little did I know, this would be the last time I ever saw him. In the same way, at least. I was going to hug him before I left, but he turned away from me to face the window, as if the plants were actually talking to him. I didn't return again, until 2 days later, when I finally got some free time. He was in bed sleeping, so I just sat beside him while finishing some work on my laptop. But by the time I'd finished, he was still asleep. So I got a little restless and took his duvet off to put it on him again. But when I did, I noticed a mark on his arm. It was red, so I knew it was new. I would have just let it go, but there was this weird nagging feeling in my head that wouldn't leave me alone. So for the next few weeks, I paid very close attention. Every time I visited, he had fresh marks on his arms, legs, joints, everywhere. I knew it had to be more than just old people's clumsiness, so I decided to tell the nurse about it, which turned out to be something I still regret to this day. "He just gets fidgety sometimes, you know how old people are," she told me. After that, the nurse practically ran off. That answer wasn't enough for me, so my naive self came up with a new plan, to tell another nurse about it. "Well, he hasn't said anything about being in pain, has he?" She said it in a sarcastic tone. It was condescending, cold. After that, I stopped asking about it, partly because I felt too awkward, but mostly because I didn't want to annoy the staff members who were around my dad all day. I didn't even consider that there was something much darker going on. And for the next few weeks, everything seemed fine. No more injuries. My dad was laughing, going on walks. Until one day, when I noticed a rusty color on the armpits of my dad's t-shirt. It was obviously from his deodorant, but it grossed me out so much that I just had to help him change. But when I pulled the shirt off, I was so shocked my eyes nearly popped out of my head, because on his right upper arm was a large, dark bruise. My stomach twisted, and I felt like I wanted to puke. I felt so many emotions at once. It was clear that it wasn't a natural injury, or clumsiness. The nurses thought they had gotten away with it, that I was just another son who didn't really care about his dad. But my dad was my superhero, and they were about to see wrong they really were. I left the nursing home that day with my hands shaking. I sat in my car for a good 20 minutes trying to calm down enough to drive. I couldn't get the image of that massive bruise out of my head. What kind of person does that to a helpless old man? I kept picturing my dad, the guy who taught me to stand up for myself when I was bullied in middle school, now unable to defend himself or even tell me what was happening. When I finally got home, I paced around my living room for hours trying to figure out what to do. Confronting the staff hadn't worked. Going to the administration would probably just lead to more dismissive excuses. I thought about installing a hidden camera in Dad's room, but I'd read online that hidden cameras were illegal in nursing homes due to privacy laws. Plus, they'd probably find it right away. I called my friend Riley, who's a social worker, asking what my options were. She told me I could file a complaint with state agencies, but the investigation could take months, and without solid proof, they might not do anything. Meanwhile, Dad would still be there, vulnerable. "You know what really sucks?" I told Riley. "If I pull him out now, I'd have to find somewhere else for him to go immediately. And what if the next place is just as bad or worse?" I had visited 12 facilities before choosing Sunny Meadows. It had seemed like the best option by far. That night, I barely slept. I kept having these horrible nightmares where I could hear my dad calling for help, but I couldn't find him. I woke up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat and with a crazy idea forming in my head. What if I could see what was really happening at Sunny Meadows from the inside? I'm not normally an impulsive guy. I think things through. I make pro and con lists. But the image of that bruise on my dad's arm had flipped some switch inside me. The next morning, I called my boss and asked for an extended leave of absence. I told him my dad's condition was worsening and I needed to focus on his care. He wasn't happy, but I had enough saved vacation days and FMLA time to make it work. Next, I did some research on Sunny Meadows. The facility had a short-term rehabilitation wing where people stayed after surgeries or injuries. They weren't just for permanent residents with memory issues like my dad. I started forming a plan. It was ridiculous and probably wouldn't work, but I had to try something. I spent the next week preparing. I went to a thrift store and bought clothes that made me look older and more frail. Loose-fitting pants that I could stuff with padding to make my legs look thinner. Button-up shirts a size too large. I bought a cane even though I didn't need one. I let my beard grow out and bought some temporary hair dye to add more gray. I looked up the medical director at Sunny Meadows, a Dr. Patel. I created a fake email account and sent him a message, pretending to be Dr. Thompson. a completely made-up person, from a hospital in the next town over. In the email, I explained that I had a patient who needed short-term placement while recovering from a minor stroke. I figured if they called to verify, they'd hit a dead end, but it was worth a shot. To my surprise, Dr. Patel's office responded quickly, saying they had space available. They sent admission forms for Charles Wilson, my fake identity, to fill out. I spent hours crafting a believable medical history. I listed allergies and medications that would be easy to fake. I downloaded medical chart templates online and filled them out with information that would be hard to verify but easy to believe. I used my basic Photoshop skills to create a fake driver's license for Charles Wilson. It wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny, but I hoped it would be enough for basic admission paperwork. For the stroke symptoms, I decided to fake mild left side weakness and some memory issues. Nothing too dramatic, but enough to justify a short rehab stay. The hardest part was figuring out how to pay for this. I couldn't use my insurance, obviously. I set up a new bank account under Charles Wilson, using my address, and transferred enough money to cover a 2-week stay. I figured 2 weeks should be enough time to gather evidence. 2 days before admission, I visited my dad as usual. He was sleeping through most of my visit again, which was concerning. When he woke up briefly, he seemed groggy and disoriented, more so than usual. I checked his arms and found 2 new bruises on his forearm. They looked like fingerprints. I carefully documented them with my phone, making sure to get clear photos. I told him I might not be able to visit for a few days because of work, but that I'd be thinking about him. He just stared at me blankly, then asked when James was coming to visit. It broke my heart all over again, but I told him James would come soon. What else could I say? The day of my admission, I was terrified. I practiced my stroke symptoms for hours. A slight dragging of my left foot, holding my left arm a bit stiffly, occasionally seeming confused about simple questions. I'd watched enough YouTube videos on stroke recovery to mimic the basics. Riley drove me to Sunny Meadows. She thought my plan was insane but agreed to help. She'd done some community theater in college and really got into her role as my concerned niece. She helped me fill out the paperwork, occasionally correcting my responses to support our story that I'd had memory issues since the stroke. The admissions nurse, a woman named Karma, who I hadn't met during my visits with Dad, seemed to buy our act. She was professional but distant, barely looking at me as she reviewed the paperwork. When she asked for my insurance card, Riley smoothly explained that we'd be paying out of pocket for now, while insurance issues were being resolved. Karma seemed satisfied with that, especially when Riley handed over a cashier's check for the first week. The tour of the rehab wing was quick and impersonal. I noticed the rehab section was separated from the memory care unit where my dad stayed, but they shared some common areas and staff. Perfect. My room was small but private. I'd made sure to pay for a private room to minimize the risk of a roommate figuring out my deception. After Riley left, promising to visit soon, I sat on the edge of my bed feeling totally out of my depth. What the hell was I doing? I could get in serious trouble for this, but then I remembered that bruise on Dad's arm, and my resolve hardened. I had to find out what was happening. The first night was uneventful. A nurse named Thomas came in to check my vitals and give me my medications, vitamins I'd brought in a pill organizer. I pretended to be more confused than I actually felt, asking him the same questions repeatedly. He was patient, but clearly in a hurry. The next morning, I decided to start exploring. I shuffled down to the dining area for breakfast, carefully maintaining my left-sided weakness act. I sat at a table with 2 elderly women who barely acknowledged me. From there, I had a good view of the room and could see some of the staff interactions. I noticed Richard, the nurse who had brushed off my concerns about Dad's bruises, roughly handling an elderly man in a wheelchair. He wasn't violent, but he was impatient, jerking the wheelchair around corners and practically shoving food into the man's mouth. When the man coughed and spit out some applesauce, Richard rolled his eyes and muttered something I couldn't hear. Over the next 3 days, I established a routine. I'd go to my scheduled physical therapy sessions, where I had to be careful not to appear too capable, eat meals in the common dining room, and spend time in the shared recreational areas where residents from both wings mingled. I was hoping to spot my dad, but he wasn't brought to any of the activities I attended. On the 4th day, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I was sitting in the TV room, pretending to doze but actually observing, when Richard and Jennifer, the nurse who had been condescending to me, came in to escort an elderly resident back to her room. "You on duty for the Baker ward tonight?" Richard asked Jennifer quietly. "Yeah, with Jamie. She's bringing the usual supplies. Thompson's getting worse. Needs double the dose now to stay quiet through the night," Jennifer replied. Thompson. That was my dad's last name. I fought to keep my face relaxed as my mind raced. What dose were they giving him? What supplies did Jamie bring? It sounded like they were sedating him, possibly with something not prescribed by his doctor. That night, I waited until after the 10 p.m. bed check, then carefully got up and put on the robe and slippers I'd brought. I shuffled out into the hallway, using my cane. When a night shift aide spotted me, I mumbled something about being confused and looking for the bathroom. She guided me back to my room, and I thanked her, saying I'd be fine now. I waited another hour, then tried again. This time, I made it to the door separating the rehab wing from the memory care unit. It had a keypad lock, but I'd been watching staff enter the code for days. I slowly punched in the numbers. 1954. The door clicked open. The memory care wing was dimly lit and quieter than the rehab section. Most patients were likely asleep. I knew my dad's room was near the end of the hall. I moved as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was sure someone would hear it. I passed the nurse's station, which appeared empty. Good. I reached my dad's room and gently pushed the door open. He was asleep in his bed, but something seemed off. His breathing was too slow, too shallow. I approached carefully and noticed a fresh bruise on his cheek that definitely hadn't been there during my last visit. Just as I was reaching for my phone to take a picture, I heard voices approaching. I quickly slipped into the bathroom attached to Dad's room, leaving the door cracked so I could see. Jamie and Jennifer entered, whispering to each other. Jamie was carrying a small kit that looked like a makeup bag. "This old man is driving me crazy," Jennifer said, her voice low but clearly annoyed. "He tried to hit me again today when I was changing him." "Well, he won't be a problem tonight," Jamie replied, unzipping the bag. She pulled out a syringe and a small vial of something. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. They were injecting my dad with something unauthorized. I silently took out my phone and started recording through the crack in the door. Jamie measured out a dose from the vial, far more than seemed appropriate for someone my dad's size. "Isn't that too much?" Jennifer asked, sounding nervous. "It's fine. Dr. Patel never checks these patients anyway. As long as they're quiet and don't cause problems, he signs whatever I put in front of him," Jamie replied, sounding completely confident. I continued recording as Jamie injected the substance into my dad's IV line. Within minutes, his breathing became even more labored. Jennifer checked his pulse and nodded, seeming satisfied. "He'll be out until morning now. No more calling for his brother or whatever," Jamie said, packing up her supplies. As they turned to leave, I quickly tucked myself behind the shower curtain, praying they wouldn't need to use the bathroom. They didn't. As soon as they left, I moved back to my dad's bedside. His breathing was so shallow now, I had to put my ear near his mouth to make sure he was still alive. I knew I had to get help immediately. This wasn't just rough handling or neglect. They were drugging him, possibly endangering his life. I took more pictures of the fresh bruises, then reluctantly left his room. I needed to call 911, but I couldn't do it from inside the facility without blowing my cover. I made my way back to the rehab wing, narrowly avoiding a night aid. Once in my room, I changed quickly into street clothes I'd hidden in my suitcase. I waited until the hall was clear, then slipped out through a side door I'd identified earlier that had a faulty alarm. Once outside, I ran to my car, which Riley had parked in a visitor spot that morning. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove about a mile away, parked in a gas station lot, and called 911. I told the dispatcher that I had reason to believe patients at Sunny Meadows were being abused and unlawfully sedated. I gave my real name and explained the situation, including that my father was a resident there. I didn't mention my undercover charade. That could come later. The dispatcher assured me they would send officers immediately. I drove back to Sunny Meadows and parked where I could see the entrance. Within 15 minutes, 2 police cars arrived with lights flashing but no sirens. I approached one of the officers as they were entering and identified myself as the caller. Officer Rodriguez took my statement while his partner and 2 other officers went inside. I showed him the video I'd taken and the photos of my dad's bruises from the past several weeks. He seemed genuinely concerned and asked detailed questions about what I'd witnessed. "Sir, what you did was extremely risky and potentially illegal," he told me after I explained my undercover operation. "But I understand why you felt you had no choice. This evidence is very compelling." While we were talking, paramedics arrived. Officer Rodriguez instructed them to check on my father first, based on what I'd shown him about the unauthorized sedation. I paced nervously as they went inside. About 20 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Jennifer and Jamie were being led out in handcuffs. Richard was arguing loudly with one of the officers. Patricia, the facility director I'd met during my initial tour, had arrived and looked absolutely shell-shocked. The paramedics were bringing my dad out on a stretcher. I ran over, my heart in my throat. One of them told me they were taking him to the hospital to counteract whatever he'd been given and evaluate his condition. I explained who I really was, showing my actual ID, and they allowed me to ride in the ambulance with him. At the hospital, the emergency room doctor confirmed my worst fears. My dad had been given dangerously high doses of a sedative not prescribed to him. The doctor said that regular administration of such high doses could cause respiratory depression, heart issues, and even death in elderly patients. They were running toxicology tests to determine exactly what had been in his system and for how long. I stayed by his bed all night as they monitored him and administered fluids to help clear the drugs from his system. Around 3 a.m., he opened his eyes and looked at me with more clarity than I'd seen in months. "Michael?" he said, actually using my name. "What happened? Where am I?" I almost started crying on the spot. I explained simply that he'd been given the wrong medication at the nursing home and was now in the hospital. I didn't want to upset him with the full truth. "They hurt me," he said, his voice small and confused. "I tried to tell you, but I couldn't remember the words. That broke me." I held his hand and promised him no one would hurt him again. He squeezed my hand before drifting back to sleep, this time a natural sleep rather than a drugged unconsciousness. The next morning, Officer Rodriguez came to take my formal statement. He informed me that Jamie and Jennifer had been arrested on multiple charges, including elder abuse, assault, illegal administration of controlled substances, and falsification of medical records. Richard was being investigated as an accomplice. They'd found Jamie's bag with several unmarked vials of sedatives and painkillers. "We have reason to believe they've been doing this to multiple patients," he told me. "The state licensing board has been notified, and they're launching a full investigation of the facility." When I asked about my undercover stunt, he gave me a stern look. "Technically, you committed identity fraud and trespassing, but given the circumstances and the evidence you uncovered, the department isn't interested in pursuing charges against you. Just don't ever do anything like this again." I promised I wouldn't, feeling equal parts relieved and vindicated. Over the next few days, I learned more about what had been happening at Sunny Meadows. Jamie, Jennifer, and Richard had been sedating difficult patients to make their shifts easier. They targeted residents with dementia or other cognitive issues who couldn't reliably report what was happening to them. My dad, with his occasional aggressive episodes related to his boxing flashbacks, had become one of their prime targets. The physical abuse appeared to be mostly retaliatory. When patients resisted care or became agitated, these staff members would handle them roughly, sometimes deliberately causing pain or injury. The bruises I documented on my dad matched the patterns seen on other victims. Patricia, the facility director, claimed she had no knowledge of the abuse, but investigation revealed she had ignored previous complaints and failed to implement proper monitoring procedures. She was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. I spent the next week finding a new facility for my dad. This time, I was even more thorough in my research. I spoke directly with family members of current residents. I made unannounced visits at different times of day. I researched the backgrounds of key staff members. I found a smaller facility called Willow Grove that specialized exclusively in memory care for Alzheimer's patients. The staff-to-patient ratio was higher, and they had cameras in all common areas, though not in individual rooms. During this time, my dad stayed in the hospital longer than medically necessary, as the doctors were sympathetic to our situation and wanted to ensure he was fully recovered before discharge. When they finally released him, I took him straight to Willow Grove. The transition was difficult. Dad was more confused and agitated than usual, which the doctors said could be partially due to withdrawal from the sedatives he'd been receiving at Sunny Meadows. But the staff at Willow Grove were patient and kind, using gentle redirection techniques rather than chemical restraints when he became agitated. 2 weeks after the arrests, I received a call from the district attorney's office. They wanted me to testify about what I'd witnessed if the case went to trial. I immediately agreed. The DA explained that they had already gathered statements from several other families whose loved ones showed similar signs of abuse. With my video evidence and the physical evidence they'd collected, they had a strong case. I visited Dad every day at Willow Grove. Some days he recognized me, other days he still called me James, but he seemed calmer overall, and the staff always welcomed me warmly. They encouraged me to join in activities with him and showed me ways to connect even when he was having a bad day. One afternoon, about a month after everything happened, I was sitting with Dad in the garden at Willow Grove. He was having a good day. He'd remembered my name twice and even asked about my job. As we sat there watching birds at the feeder, he suddenly turned to me with unexpected clarity in his eyes. "You know, I remember some things," he said slowly. "Not everything, but I remember being afraid, and now I'm not anymore." I didn't know what to say. I just held his hand, feeling a mix of gratitude that he was safe now and lingering anger at what he'd endured. "You've always been a good son, Michael," he continued, surprising me by using my name again. "Your mother would be proud of you." That night, driving home from Willow Grove, I finally let myself cry. Really cry, for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Not just for what had happened, but for everything we'd lost to Alzheimer's, and for the small victory of saving my dad from people who should have been caring for him, but instead had betrayed that trust in the worst way. The case against Jamie, Jennifer, and Richard was moving forward. Patricia was also facing charges for negligence and failure to report suspected abuse. The state had implemented emergency oversight of Sunny Meadows, bringing in temporary management until they determined whether the facility could remain open. I went back to work part-time, arranging my schedule so I could visit Dad regularly. My boss was surprisingly understanding after I explained the situation. He even organized a collection among my coworkers to buy games and art supplies for the residents at Willow Grove. The bruises on Dad's body had faded, but the emotional scars would take longer to heal, for both of us. Still, knowing that the people who hurt him would face justice gave me some peace. And seeing him safe and actually receiving proper care made all the risks I'd taken worth it. Dad might not always remember who I am, but I will never forget who he is. My hero who deserves dignity and respect, especially when he can't demand it for himself. I've never testified in court before. When the day finally came, I was a nervous wreck. I must have changed my shirt 3 times because I kept sweating through them. The DA had prepped me thoroughly, but still, my stomach was doing somersaults as I walked into that courtroom. Jamie, Jennifer, and Richard were all sitting at the defense table looking like completely different people from the nurses I'd known. Gone were the scrubs, replaced with formal attire that made them look almost respectable. It was jarring seeing them trying to appear innocent when I knew exactly what they'd done. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No dramatic high ceilings or fancy woodwork like on TV. Just a regular room with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable benches. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, had a no-nonsense attitude that became apparent the moment proceedings began. When it was my turn to testify, I felt like my legs might give out as I walked to the witness stand. The DA had my photos and video ready as evidence. I described finding the bruises on my dad, my failed attempts to get answers from the staff, and eventually, my desperate undercover plan. I could feel Jamie glaring at me the whole time, but I focused on answering the questions clearly. "And is this the video you recorded on the night in question?" the DA asked, playing my shaky footage of Jamie injecting something into my dad's IV while Jennifer watched. "Yes, that's exactly what I witnessed," I confirmed. The defense attorney tried hard to discredit me during cross-examination. He suggested I had a vendetta against the nursing home, that I was angry about having to put my father in care, that I had manufactured evidence. His questions got increasingly hostile. So you committed fraud to gain access to a medical facility, misrepresented yourself as a patient, and trespassed in areas you weren't authorized to enter. Is that correct, Mr. Thompson? He asked with a smirk. Yes, I admitted, because all proper channels had failed, and my father was being abused. Moved to strike as non-responsive, the defense attorney said immediately. Overruled, the judge replied, giving me a long look. The witness may explain his actions. After I testified, there were several expert witnesses. A toxicologist confirmed the substances found in my dad's system matched the vials from Jamie's bag. A geriatric specialist detailed how dangerous those dosages were for elderly patients. A former Sunny Meadows nurse had come forward to testify that she'd reported concerns about patient treatment to Patricia multiple times and been ignored. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every day, even though my boss was getting impatient about my continued absences. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts for all 4 defendants on most charges. Jamie received the harshest sentence, 12 years for elder abuse, unauthorized administration of controlled substances, and assault. Jennifer got 8 years for similar charges. Richard received 5 years for his role as an accomplice. Patricia was sentenced to 3 years for criminal negligence and failure to report abuse. After the sentencing, Officer Rodriguez met me outside the courthouse. You did good, he said, shaking my hand. Your dad would be proud. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, but knowing those people were going to prison gave me some peace. The state's investigation into Sunny Meadows revealed a shocking pattern of abuse affecting at least 14 residents. The facility was ultimately shut down, and all patients were transferred to other care centers. Several families reached out to thank me for exposing what was happening. One woman hugged me in the courthouse hallway, crying as she told me her mother had been at Sunny Meadows for 2 years, and they had never understood why she kept getting unexplained injuries. Meanwhile, Dad continued to have good days and bad days at Willow Grove. The staff there were absolute angels. There was one nurse, Maria, who had a special way with him. She'd bring him peppermint candies, his favorite, and sit with him looking through old photo albums I'd provided. On days when he was agitated, she knew exactly how to calm him down without resorting to excessive medication. About 6 months after the trial ended, I was visiting Dad when he had one of his most lucid days in a long time. We were sitting in the garden area, and he actually remembered details about a fishing trip we'd taken when I was 12. You caught that big trout, and were so excited you fell right into the river. He chuckled. Your mother was furious about the mud all over the car. I couldn't believe he recalled something so specific. I cherished these moments of clarity, knowing they were becoming increasingly rare. Dad, can I ask you something? I said carefully. Do you remember anything about Sunny Meadows? His expression changed immediately. A shadow passed over his face, and his hands started trembling slightly. The dark place, he murmured. They hurt me there, but you stopped them. I was stunned. You remember that? He nodded slowly. Not everything, but I remember being afraid all the time. And then you came and took me away. He reached out and patted my hand. You've always looked out for me, James. And there it was. The clarity was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't correct him this time. I just squeezed his hand and told him I always would look out for him. That night, I broke down in my car. It was a mixture of grief and relief. Grief because his moments of lucidity were becoming shorter and further apart. Relief because despite everything, he remembered that I had saved him, even if he got my name wrong. I had to make a big decision around that time. My company was downsizing, and my boss offered me a severance package. After the trial and all my absences, I think he figured I'd be an easy person to let go. I surprised him by accepting immediately. With the severance and my savings, I calculated I could take about a year off before needing to find another job. I used that time to volunteer at Willow Grove. At first, I just helped with activities and spent time with Dad. But soon, I was assisting with their website, upgrading their computer systems, and eventually developing a tracking application that helped staff monitor residents' health patterns. The administration was so impressed they offered me a part-time IT position, which I gladly accepted. It meant less money than my corporate job, but the flexible schedule allowed me to see Dad almost every day. One morning, Maria called me urgently. Dad had had a fall and was being transferred to the hospital. I raced over, my heart pounding. By the time I arrived, he was already in the emergency room. The doctor told me he'd suffered a minor stroke. They were able to stabilize him, but he would need more intensive care going forward. For the next week, I practically lived at the hospital. Dad was confused and agitated, not understanding where he was or why. The hospital staff tried their best, but they didn't know him like the Willow Grove team did. After he pulled out his IV twice and tried to leave his room several times, they suggested restraints. I refused, and instead took shifts with Maria, who visited on her days off, to ensure someone familiar was always with him. When he was finally released, we faced another challenge. His care needs had increased significantly, and Willow Grove wasn't equipped to handle them. I faced the prospect of finding yet another facility, going through the whole vetting process again, and traumatizing Dad with another move. After a sleepless night weighing my options, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I decided to care for Dad at home. I converted my living room into a bedroom for him, invested in proper medical equipment, and hired a part-time home health aide to help when I needed to work. I took classes on caregiving for stroke recovery and dementia patients. My small IT job at Willow Grove allowed me the flexibility to make this work. It wasn't easy. The first month was absolute chaos. Dad would wake up at 3 a.m. convinced he needed to go to work. He sometimes didn't recognize my apartment and would become frightened, thinking he'd been kidnapped. There were days when he refused to eat anything I prepared, insisting it was poisoned. but there were good moments too. Evenings when we'd watch old westerns together, and he'd remember entire scenes. Mornings when I'd find him looking at family photos with a smile on his face. And unlike at Sunny Meadows, when he became agitated or confused, I could comfort him without fear that someone would hurt him when I wasn't there. The home health aide, Josephine, became like family. She taught me little tricks for getting Dad to take his medication and techniques for helping him shower safely. When I needed a break, she would stay a few extra hours, telling me firmly that I couldn't care for him if I didn't also care for myself. About 8 months after I brought Dad home, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the state's Victim Compensation Fund, informing me that as part of the settlement against Sunny Meadows' parent company, Dad was entitled to a significant compensation payment. The money would help cover his care needs for years to come. I sat down with Dad to tell him the news, even though I wasn't sure he would understand. "We don't have to worry about money for your care anymore," I explained simply. "The people who hurt you have to pay for what they did." He looked at me with surprising clarity. "Good," he said firmly. "They were bad people." Then he pointed to a photo of himself and my mom from their wedding day. "Have you seen Martha lately? She should be home from work soon." And just like that, he was gone again. Lost in a time 40 years past, but he was safe and as comfortable as I could make him. Last week, we celebrated Dad's 78th birthday. It was a small gathering. Just me, Josephine, Maria from Willow Grove, and Riley, who has remained a steadfast friend throughout this entire ordeal. Dad was having a good day, and actually seemed to enjoy himself, laughing at Riley's jokes and eating 2 slices of chocolate cake. After everyone left, Dad and I sat on the small balcony off my apartment, where I'd installed a porch swing. The living room had been partially converted into his bedroom, but we could still access the balcony through the sliding door. He stared at the sunset with a peaceful expression. "You're a good boy," he said suddenly, patting my knee. "I don't always remember your name, but I know you're a good boy." "Thanks, Dad," I replied, my throat tight. "Did I ever tell you about the time your grandfather taught me to fish?" he asked. "No, tell me," I said, even though I'd heard the story dozens of times. As he launched into the familiar tale, I realized something important. The nightmare at Sunny Meadows had changed me forever. I couldn't fix Dad's Alzheimer's. I couldn't give him back the memories that were slipping away, but I could ensure that his remaining time was spent in dignity and safety. Sometimes when I look at my dad now, I still see the superhero who taught me to ride a bike and scared away the monsters under my bed. Other times I see a vulnerable man who needs my protection, but always, I see someone worth fighting for, and if I had to do it all again, the undercover operation, the trial, giving up my career, I would, in a heartbeat.